Sweden is a pretty good country, lovely nature, decent economy, good work-life balance. Norway and Finland aren't too shabby either. They're among the richest and happiest countries in the world. And Denmark. Well, Denmark has good beer at least. The problem is that all the Nordic countries are pretty small. It's difficult to change the world when you're just a tiny country in the north. So what would happen if all the Nordic countries joined into one union? It's not a new concept. We tried that in the 14 and 1500s as the Kalmar Union. But how would it look today, and what would the impact be on the world? Let's have a look at what it would mean to have a unified Nordic federal state. The Nordic countries consist of Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark and Iceland. The self-governing areas of Greenland, the Faroe Islands and the Åland Islands are also included in that. Oh, and Svalbard. Let's start with some population numbers. Sweden has 10.54 million people and Denmark has 5.95 million. Finland comes next with 5.58 million people and then Norway with 5.52. Iceland just has a population of 390,000, but they have volcanoes, so that's fine. Volcanoes are awesome. The total population of the Nordic federal state would be around 28 million people, which would make it the 54th most populous state in the world and the 10th biggest in Europe. It would be just above Australia, but below Venezuela, so it wouldn't really be all that big when it comes to inhabitants. But let's talk about land area instead. Sweden is actually the 5th biggest country in Europe, with 440,000 square kilometers, and Finland and Norway are also in the top 10. The total area of the Nordic Federation would be 1,250,000 square kilometers, and it would be the 3rd biggest country in Europe. Oh, but wait, I forgot about Greenland. Greenland adds more than 2 million square kilometers just by itself. The new total would be 3.4 million square kilometers. That would place the Nordic Federation at, well, still 3rd place actually. Russia and Ukraine are both quite huge, so they'd still be bigger either way. The Nordic Federation would still be a pretty big country that covers an area from the Arctic in the far north all the way down to continental Europe. Now, what about some other numbers? What about the economy and the military, for example? The Nordics all have pretty decent economies for having such small populations. Sweden is Europe's 12th biggest economy with a GDP of $620 billion. Norway comes in at 504 billion, Denmark at 450 billion and Finland at 304 billion. And Iceland is also there with 35 billion. Combined, that would be a GDP of $1.9 trillion. It would be Europe's 6th biggest economy, bigger than Spain. And actually the 12th biggest in the world, so it would qualify as a G20 country. That's not too shabby for a bunch of introverted northerners. Something interesting is that the Nordic Federation would be a big economy, but work-life balance would also be good. There are many countries in the world with bigger economies, but many of those places also require you to devote your life to work. I'm looking at you, America. Sweden and the Nordic countries in general value having time for hobbies and time for your family and your loved ones. Work doesn't define you in the same way over here. You don't live to work, you work to be able to live. And by live, I mean spending time in nature and drinking yourself to oblivion every weekend. That's all pretty standard in the Nordics. Things get a bit more complicated when discussing the military power of a potential Nordic federation. All of the other statistics can simply be added, and then you compare that number against all other countries. Military power is more complex. I mean, what metrics do you measure against? Active personnel, number of tanks, level of technology, intelligence service? There are simply too many factors that determine a country's military power. And it's also different if we're talking about defensive power or the possibility to project power onto other countries. Sweden is a pretty difficult country to invade, and our entire military strategy centers around defending the country, not attacking anyone else. There are many people who try to define each country's military power by weighing in all of these different aspects, and according to one such list, Sweden is at place 27 in the world. Norway, Denmark and Finland are also in the top 50, and Iceland is also on the list. But it's not possible to simply add up all of these indices and get a new combined ranking. At least it's too complex for me to do. Either way, the Nordic Federation would still not be able to compete with the top military powers in the world. The US, Russia and China are all on a completely different level, for example. But it would be a pretty significant military power, mostly focused on defense, though. It sounds pretty good so far, doesn't it? The United Nordics would be a pretty significant player, so what's stopping the Union from happening? Well, first of all, we already tried that between 1397 and 1523 as the Kalmar Union. That was a bit different though. It was a personal union where one ruler held the crown of all three countries. And by three countries I mean Sweden, Denmark and Norway. Finland was unfortunately not its own country back then. It was East Sweden. And Iceland was part of Norway, so it was pretty similar to the Nordic Union I'm talking about today. The Kalmar Union fell apart though, because when Christian II of Denmark was king of the Union, the Swedes felt extremely mistreated. Christian II is still known as Christian the Tyrant in Sweden. So the modern union would have to be different. It would have to be a proper union with representatives from each area so that no one feels neglected. And that would also fit with the Nordic mindset of cooperation and collectivism. But there are other problems. Why would these 5 countries and self-ruling areas want to join the union? Norway has a lot of oil and it's a rich country. Would it want to share that wealth with the rest of the Nordics? Finland has a strong military and it's focused on having a strong defense against Russia. Would they want to take the responsibility of defending their borders so that the entire Nordics can be safe? And Denmark probably wouldn't care. They're all drunk and lazy anyway, so they'd join as long as no one took away their beer. And while Sweden is the biggest country with the biggest economy in the Nordics, there are also quite a few issues as well. Sweden has a problem with gang criminality, and the immigration politics haven't exactly been excellent either. Would the other countries be scared of Sweden's failure in handling both of these issues? And Sweden doesn't have a stellar reputation in general in the Nordics. Not bad, but not great. Swedes are seen as pretty weak and too diplomatic. There's a lot of wishy-washiness in Sweden. And Swedes are often seen as having a big brother complex. They see themselves as the natural leaders in the Nordics. But that's not exactly how the other countries see it. The Nordics are all a big family, but like with all families, there's a lot of sibling rivalry. Like between Sweden and Denmark, as you might have noticed in this video. We'd absolutely jump to defend each other against anyone else, but we also bicker and argue, just like obnoxious children. Okay, but let's say that we go ahead with the union anyway. What would it be called? People online talk about this topic now and then, and some suggestions center around the old Kalmar Union, like the Kalmar Union 2.0 or the Kalmar Reunion. Swedes often joke that it should be called the Kingdom of Sweden and Company, or things like that. Other Swedes suggest names like the Four Friends and Denmark. I mentioned that there's a rivalry between Sweden and Denmark, and that's because Sweden and Denmark are the 2 countries in the world that have fought the most wars ever. So the rivalry between the 2 countries used to be quite bloody. Other ideas for union names often include something about Scandinavia, but that would make Finland and Iceland pretty sulky. They're part of the Nordics but not Scandinavia. But given the boring nature of Swedes in particular, I think that the most reasonable name would be the Nordic Federation. It's simple, it's straight to the point, and it lacks all kinds of poetry. It's perfect for the Nordics, in other words. Another question is, where would the capital be located? Stockholm might seem obvious, at least to people living in Stockholm, but it's not ideally located. Copenhagen would be closer to Europe, so that's a positive thing. One of the few positive things about Denmark. Helsinki would probably be a bit too close to Russia for comfort. And Reykjavik, I don't think so. Sorry Iceland, I love you guys, but it's just too far off. Oslo could be an option. It's actually not a bad option at all, to be honest. But I think that it would be wise to not pick an existing capital, so all of the ones I've mentioned so far should be ruled out. It's tempting to pick Kalmar for historical reasons. That's where the old Kalmar Union was founded after all. If you look at the geographic middle point of Scandinavia, it's somewhere in Lake Vänern in Sweden. But I guess that it wouldn't be the most clever thing to have a capital in the middle of a lake. Some options could be the historical town of Skara, which is close to Vänern, or even Vänersborg or Jönköping. But a capital needs to have good infrastructure, and you can't just pick a small rural town and expect it to accommodate state visits. So my best bet would be that Gothenburg would be the best option for a new Nordic capital. It's a decently big city, and it's easy to get to from Stockholm, Oslo, as well as Copenhagen. And it has a lovely archipelago. Almost as good as Stockholm. So if the Nordic Federation ever happens, I hope that Gothenburg is selected as the capital. Then the people of Gothenburg will finally have something that actually makes it better than Stockholm. And that's about it for a look at what a unified Nordic state could look like. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.